A little bit about myself. I'm also known as the Revit Geek. I have been in the industry for an extreme long time, and I've been using Revit since about 2004, I think it was. So I've been using Revit for quite a long time, and a few years ago, I've been using Revit officially longer than I used AutoCAD. So it's kind of a nice scenario for me. So I am a BIM consultant based out of the Denver, Colorado area. I have spoken at Midwest University quite a few years. Obviously, we're doing this online for ATG and Midwest University. Since we all in the current situation where we can't, be live and talking to everybody and interacting in person. So a little bit talking about this session. So the session, we are going to be getting in and talking about detail items, how we can use detail items, how we can embellish those views, what we're going to go through and set that information up. We're not necessarily going to be talking about 3D detailing, right? I'm not going to go in and model every single piece of CMU or anything like that. So this is more about how can we use the intelligence of the 2D stuff in Revit, because this is one of those things that always drives me crazy when I get in and see people, they're using Revit, but they're just drawing lines and filled regions for their details, right? We're still going to need to do details, even if we were modeling. Nobody's modeling to the level that this little image is showing on the screen. So we're not getting into any of that information. We're just really going to be coming in and, okay, here we go. Let's talk about how we can use these things. Now, I always like my sessions to be interactive. So feel free, ask questions along the way. I might even unmute you possibly if I'm really looking about, hey, I don't understand the written question. But the big thing I do ask is please put the question in the question and answers pod. We have the chat pod as well as the question and answers pod. It's much easier to keep track of questions in the Q&A pod than it is to be going into the chat pod. By all means, feel free to talk to each other or give comments, follow-ups in the chat pod, other suggestions, things I might miss. I mean, I do always like to say that one of the best Revit tips I ever took out was during my session I was presenting. Somebody showed me something like, oh my God, I did not know you can do that. So I'm always open to suggestions, thoughts from anybody attending or paying attention as well. If you're obviously watching this recording later, you're not going to get any of that stuff. So hopefully this is just for the lucky attendees who are watching the session online. So a couple of things here, and usually I do this as a poll for the live audience, but we're going to use this with the little raise your hand thing. Just kind of some examples of how people are doing their details with, the 2D stuff. We might do a lot of 3D details as well, but how are you embellishing or creating your typical details? Just by show of hands for everybody, how many people are just like annotating, drawing a detail and just annotating over it with text? So they're just typing in their novels of text. And for me, I have noticed in this scenario, a lot of people who raise their hand to this one and say, or a lot of times it's structural or mechanical MEP engineers. Architects may be using some more of the tagging type scenario, but for a lot of the people inside of there, we're going to be seeing just, a lot of people go through and just, go through it with text. There's nothing wrong with any of these ways. I'm just going to try to open your eyes up to additional types of scenarios. Okay, so looks pretty good. And then the next question is how many people are actually annotating using tags, either keynoting or element tagging? So for me, this is what I'm really going to get into and present. I rarely use text in a detail. There might be an occasional piece of additional text, but for me, I'm rarely using text in a detail. So, it's hard to see by raising of hands. There's so many attendees in here, but I'm going to say probably 25% of you guys are doing it this way. So again, kind of a nice little scenario in there. Now, for the graphic side of things, how many people are just drawing detail lines and filled regions? You're going to go in, just going to draw some lines, filled regions, go through and, either annotate or possibly tag those types of scenarios. Yeah, so either only 25% of you are awake, or it's pretty consistent on how people are annotating in here. So one of the two things, I'm not really sure how that's working. Okay, so then for my thing in here is how many people are going to be going in and doing mostly things with detail items. So how many people are literally going in and just using detail items for probably 90% of the information, and then either tagging or doing text. Not really sure, just kind of going in here. We see a lot more people said they're doing a lot of detail items. So that's actually good to see. So then the last scenario on this, how many people, and I trust you, I won't harass you too bad. How many people are bringing in the AutoCAD details and just hitting the explode button? Okay, nothing wrong with this. I do know a lot of people do start setting that up, start going through and setting up. So hopefully this session is going to give you more of an alternative to just going through it. And good, I only initially had 8 people say yes to that. So I'm actually happy to see that. So what we're really going to do in this session is we are going to get into and start talking about my personal opinion on detailing best practices, right? There's hundreds of different ways to do details in Revit. This is going to kind of be one of those scenarios for me getting into and saying, hey, okay, what do I believe detailing best practices are? How do we create those details? How can we then annotate those details? And then we start talking about, possibly building in some view filters that'll do things automatically, which those things automatically might also jump into some of those tag toggles that I'll be talking about as well. And then for last but not least, then I'm going to jump into, okay, great, I'm showing you all these detail items. How can we get to a step of maybe creating those detail items, looking at those detail items, etc. So we'll kind of jump into some of those stuff. And so for those of you who know me, that's about all I ever do in PowerPoint. I'm not a big PowerPoint person. So I'm going to jump into this highly, highly sophisticated 3D building I have going on here, right? So I'm going to jump into a 3D view. So it's a highly sophisticated building. But this is kind of one of those things where I didn't want to go into, and this is an example of, somebody who might be modeling to a fairly high level of detail, right? If I start looking at this view, I've modeled it in the sheathing. I went in using a beam system and modeled in all the joists. I modeled in a rim joist. I don't care if this would be a metal deck with structural steel. You guys are kind of just getting the idea and the concept, right? It could be commercial, it could be residential. I've even went in and modeled the sill plate on all of this stuff, right? But I did not go into the wall and model like the double top plates, the single plate, or if it's metal construction, I didn't model in my runner channel, any of that stuff, right? I did even go in and model, a brick ledge. I left gaps for the waterproofing membranes. But again, even in my Revit wall styles, it's not like I'm modeling in the waterproof membrane. This is Revit, so we might have an air gap here, but it's not like it's a truly open thing. There is still a space in there. Yes, I could go make that material more transparent, but still it's going to start coming in and doing these types of scenarios. Another limitation of Revit out of the box walls is I can sure bring the brick down. You can see this is one wall type. I might be able to bring the brick down to the ledge, but I'm not even going to be able to independently then bring the sheathing down to the sill plate. I could bring the sheathing down with the brick, but I'm not going to be able to have like different areas. There's always the capability, if you're modeling to the advanced, to divide this into parts and do what you need to do with the parts. But in reality, most people aren't even taking it to this extreme, especially on an early on phase. They might even not even be modeling the joists. They might not be blocking the wall out accordingly, right? We're really not necessarily in the Revit world modeling this level of detail. Some people might be, some people may not. So it's completely up to what you guys are doing. But regardless of that, we're still going to need to come in and start embellishing 3D models. A lot of times, I don't care if you're structure, mechanical, architecture, electrical, whatever discipline you are, you're also going to have those typical details, right? We might have, for the architectural side of things, we might have a typical detail for, a door head, so a door frame, interior construction, residential, commercial. What does that door head look like? Wrapping the gypsum wall, things like that. Structure, you might have a typical footing detail, things like that, we know we're going to be having some sort of standards, and we'll be doing those all as drafting views. So with that said, I'm going to jump into kind of one of the views inside of you that we'll be looking at, right? So I can come into the section of this live model, and you can kind of start to see inside of here that yes, even though this is that section of that live model, I might need to now start showing the sheathing coming down a little bit farther. I might want to be able to do a little bit more than what we see inside of here. And even customize some of my families to where like my dimensional lumber might have the X in it automatically. Out of the box, the 3D families don't. So you might need a little bit of work to come in here, but still, Revit, we can't model all the brick. We can't model, we can go in and model the 2x studs if we wanted to. We can go in and model some more of the stuff, but in reality, it's pretty slim people who are modeling the sill plates, the top plates, etc. So how can we start coming into this view and start manipulating it? Well, like we said, some people will go in and start drawing filled regions. So maybe I haven't modeled the site in here, and I'm not going to model the site. So maybe I need to come in here and start looking at placing the earth that's going to be inside of here, all of those different types of scenarios. So for me, I'm going to do that with detail components, right? So we can actually come down to the annotate tab or over to the annotate tab. We can come down to the component tab in annotate, and we could say, hey, I want to go start placing detail components. Personally, for me, I'm not a big fan in Revit of actually going to the command and looking for that tool inside of here. Yes, I can hit this drop down. I can come in here and say, oh, gee, maybe I was looking for earth and maybe I can find that family. But one of those things for me, I start not using the detail component command, is I like to, in Revit, literally go over to the project browser. So for me in Revit, I'm going to come over to the project browser and I'm going to go down to families. This is true if you're placing walls, doors, any types of things like that. I'm going to do walls, doors, windows. You can do any command in Revit, structural columns, foundations. It doesn't matter, by finding that family in the project browser and dragging and dropping it onto the screen. So for me, if I was to come in here and start embellishing this view here, I would come in and do a detail component. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with, a lot of people are going to be like, no, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to go to filled region. I'm going to find the filled region that is earth. I'm going to come through here and start drawing some lines around the earth. Hopefully you know which line you need to be using. Maybe you want to do with invisible lines, right? Then I'm going to come in here and start saying, well, gee, we're going to have some earth that comes like over to here, right? Back over to here. But the problem with doing this as a filled region is now I even have to start coming through and be like, oh, let me trace around this object. Right, so I've got to go trace around that object where I'd want that filled region to be, and then I can say finish, and great, this worked well. I've got my filled region, not a big deal to go through and start doing that. However, for me, when I start getting into doing a lot of this, again, I'm mostly about getting into detail components. So for me, if I was going to come in here and start doing earth, I'm going to go down to my division 30, I'm going to find my earth family, and I'm going to go ahead and just drag and drop this inside of here. And you might see I have a few different types of families inside of here, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and just grab this earth. And then for me, this is a line-based family. So I can just click a start point. I can click an end point. Granted, I'm outside of the crop region, so I did start probably way farther than I needed to. But I can just go in here and start drawing this. If I wanted to show this sloping to drain, I could draw it at an angle. You know, then I could start coming in here and dragging and dropping and stretching and pushing and pulling and do what I need to do. For me, I always come in here and build a lot of things inside of there. So if I knew I was modeling this, I can see I have a start angle and an end angle. I can actually change that degree to be the same 5 degree or whatever degree I modeled that at to get this not overlapping, right? I am going to run into the same scenario in this where I was embellishing with filled regions, where if I am going over this on a 3D view and I start pulling this in, this detail component is going to overlap modeled components. And that is one thing about Revit. If you are embellishing views, the detail components will always be on top of the modeled components. The analogy I always use is, imagine you've got this thing modeled and you're actually looking at it through a piece of glass. You're drawing on a piece of glass and the modeled objects are behind you. So I can't ever put that piece of glass behind the modeled objects. So even though you've got this send to front and bring to back, all that's going to do is move it in relationship to other detail components, but it's not going to ever put it behind. So if I was doing earth in a scenario like this might be a terrible example, you know, because now I'd have to come in here like that. But one thing that does crack me up on a lot of this is there's some times where I'll just go in and start creating multiple different detail components, because there is that great flaw that everybody loves in Revit, that the hatch components don't rotate with the element. So if I come in here and draw multiple detail components in a scenario like this, that I can actually just not even tell there are multiple detail components here, because since Revit has that crappy issue of not being able to rotate filled regions in a detail component with the object itself, there's certain cases where I might be able to come in and take advantage of that, right? I might also want to come in here and then say, gee, I wanted to grab my undisturbed earth, so I can come in here and grab this, bring it across, and now I've got my different angles of disturbed and undisturbed earth type patterns in here, right? Depending on how you guys display that, some firms do it this way, some firms don't, but I could come in here and start setting this all up. The other problem is in this Revit content, I actually have an invisible line, right? So Revit's going to mask out the line weights of the invisible line. So my footing's still there, but now that line weight is extremely thin on that footing because I did put this in there. So we can choose to nudge these things up and down, or in the print settings, there is a checkbox that says do not mask. I forget what the actual term is, but it says basically don't mask lines that are over the top of each other. So regardless if it's a filled region or this, most people don't like to see it big mass. So you are going to be having to come in here and be like, oh, let me just nudge these things over, or make sure that setting in your print dialog box is what it should be to get where you need it to be. All right, so you can see kind of coming through here, setting that up. But regardless, we're still going to be embellishing over that 3D component in some cases. You might have modeled the site, you might have modeled topography, but if you do need to clarify between disturbed and undisturbed soil, not really a way to do that, not easily a way to do that with the topography command in Revit. right? So as you can see, I'm not going to come through and completely embellish this entire family or this entire view, but as you can start to see, this is really what we're starting to look at as we go through there. But what is going to happen a lot of times, and I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here, what is going to happen is we are going to have a lot of typical details set up already, or we're going to be doing the exact same thing I was just showing you in more of a type of scenario inside of here. So if I come look at my typical detail of this wall foundation, you're going to start to see that this doesn't have any reaction or relationship to the model. This is my typical or my indicative detail that I've got sitting off to the side that I can start coming through and truly modeling everything from scratch, right? So I can come in, model things from scratch, go through and do what I needed to do. So not much different than I was doing before, but a couple things I will say if we are setting things up like this that I personally like to do. So one of the things for me is if I was going to go do this, I would go create a blank drafting view, right? Drafting view, 1.5 inches, sure. We'll call this our tip, whatever, typical, whatever. All right. Now, one of the things for me that I have in a lot of things is what drives me crazy about Revit is I can start this typical drafting view, but I don't know where 0, 0 is. And if I export this out to, something else like a CAD file or anybody else, I want to know where the 0, 0 is so it makes a logical sense, right? There are tools out there. One of my favorite tools in PyRevit is the simple capability in PyRevit tool to say place origin marker. And PyRevit will literally put an X at the 0, 0 of this view. One of my favorite tools. So now when I'm modeling in any view in Revit, I know where the 0, 0 is. I can do it for title block, for sheets. I can do it for drafting views, legend views, anywhere else. I can figure out where the origin or the 0, 0 is in that case. But in reality, what I do is in my template, I actually have a view called my drafting view template. And what happens with this is I've already placed this component at that 0, 0. So if I come up here back to my PyRevit tool and say place origin marker, oops, I don't know why it's telling me I can't do that. But I would be placing an origin marker, and that would be the lower right corner in this case. So for me, if I'm going to actually go do a view, I have a detail view in here, a drafting template view. I duplicate this drafting template view with detailing. And the reason why I do this is I want it to bring in this little annotation symbol, and I'll talk about this in 1 second. But that drafting view also has reference planes the same size of that element. And these reference planes in my drafting view are going to help me place this when I put it onto a sheet. So if I drag this onto a sheet, I can actually snap to these reference planes and then snap the elements embedded into my title block. And I'm going to show that a little bit later too. So right, we're going to go back to here. So the reason why I duplicated this is for me, I have this family called my detail guide, right? It's a generic annotation family. What's great about this tells me how much room I have if I was on a particular sheet size for this project, and I was doing it 4 columns and 3 rows. So when I place this on a sheet, if I have 4 columns and 3 rows, this is the amount of room I have to detail in. I use this family even in live 3D models, right? So if I came back over here to this view and I really wanted to know how big should this be, I'm still going to go to my annotate tab. I'm going to go to symbol, and on my symbol command, I am going to find that 4 columns and 3 rows, and I'm going to place this so I know how big to make this view, right? So now I know I'm not going to place this onto a sheet. Oh crap, it's too big, it doesn't fit. I can use the symbol in live 3D views to start coming through here and saying, okay, let me go through, set this up, come through. Now I can adjust my crop region to fit within the areas that I'm supposed to have, and I don't have to go from sheet to sheet to view, or activate the view through the sheet. I can start coming here and saying, okay, that's how much room I have to work. Maybe nudge it down a little bit to get it where I want it to be and adjust the size again, whatever that needs to happen, right? So I can start going through. Oh, I forgot to nudge my detail component. But so I can start coming through here and adjust this and get this, regardless of if it's a typical drafting view or if this is going to be something over the top of the screen. Now, the other thing about this generic annotation, I mean to close that view, about the generic annotation is if I say I'm going to change it from an 1.5 inch scale to 3 inch or to 1 inch or whatever it's going to be, as I do that, this generic annotation family is going to adjust scale, right? It's generic annotation, so it adjusts and maintains the same size. So regardless if I start changing the scale, this is the area I need to fit in. So if I was trying to do this at 3 inch scale, this is literally going to let me know within a second, hey, that 3 inch scale isn't going to work for you to fit all of the data you need. So for me, this is the other reason why I love it. I use it for wall sections. I grab a 1 column and 1 row and I use it for floor plans. I start setting it up to really just start giving me the size where it's going to be what I think it's going to be. So it's something that I have, and I have that pre-built into my template, right? Now for me to start coming here and detailing, again, same scenario. You guys can go in, you can do field regions, you can do lines, but this is giving me that theory of what I want to do. Now for me, when I start laying something out, and again, I'm going to kind of get started on a scenario of something like this, I'm going to go in and start looking at some of my detail components. Again, if I go back to my detail, my pre-baked detail, I could draw a rectangle for a field region. I could draw another rectangle or another field region for this and go through and start doing it. The reason why I'm not a huge fan of doing all of the different types of rectangles, etc., is notating when we get further. So I'm going to talk about the notating, etc. The other thing that I'm not a big fan of doing filled regions is often when I go to clients' offices, one person will do a filled region for this concrete and they'll grab the concrete filled region. And once you get into that, I see Joe uses pen 6 for this. The other person uses, thin lines, medium lines, wide lines. And I'll look at a piece of concrete, and every single piece of concrete, or even like the earth where we're trying to show the line up above, if you show that, whatever, I see people using all sorts of different line types. So I don't get that same consistency in what I'm looking for. So for me, it's all about consistency in not only annotation, which I'm going to show later, but also graphic consistency, right? How many times have you been and saw a gypsum board for the architects out there, and there's 5 different line weights used on gypsum board. One guy draws in an additional line for the paper, one guy doesn't. It starts to get all over the place. So for me, when I start coming in and getting into a lot of this stuff, I go in and like all the detail components because it's always going to be consistent, right? So if I start coming over here and looking at some of the stuff, you'll see that I've got a detail component, and it's just called concrete section. I do, for the Americans out there, use the CSI naming convention. So I use the first 3 digits of CSI, and then I give it a description after that. So you'll see that this one family has all of these different options on what I'm looking for. It's got my 4-inch concrete, my 8-inch wall, my 10-inch wall. What are we starting to look on there? I might have my 12-inch footing, right? So for me, it's just going to come in here and grab that 12-inch footing. I'd give it the size I need it to be. Oops, messed up. That should have been 2 feet, right? And now I can start coming in here and positioning this in areas that make sense to fit into this view. I'm very OCD, so I'm always trying to make sure everything has a realistic number on it, right? Don't want to be here. We'll just go through and say we're going to be at 3'11". This doesn't matter in any way, shape, or form. I'm just OCD and I can't really deal with that stuff. So again, starting to come into something like this, gee, now I needed the 10-inch concrete wall on top of that. I'm going to come over here, draw this 10-inch concrete wall, go up whatever distance I need to go up. Now you'll also see that inside my families, when I start getting into this and I start getting into it, I like to build in like center lines. Is there any reason why I needed a center line on this family, both directions? Not really, but it does help me. I happen to snap beautifully, but it does help me start align things when I start detailing, right? I need to align this to that. So I'm going to come in and start just grabbing this stuff, right? Again, you could have done separate filled regions if you wanted to, not a big deal on that. I've got a concrete keyway in here. I'm going to bring this family in. Again, the other reason why I have things like center lines in there is I can go ahead and use that to help align and snap 2 elements, right? So now I've got my concrete keyway, right? Really starting to come in here and doing what I think I need to do to build this, right? Just showed you the little earth. So we'll go back down and grab my earth again, and we'll just say, okay, now I needed to show my normal earth. So we'll bring this normal earth in here, right? We'll draw it from there to there. I wanted that to be probably a little bit taller. Don't need those angles to be so extreme. I don't know why they are, right? And then I'm going to have my undisturbed soil. So I'd come down here and grab my undisturbed. I'm going to click right on the top of this and go over. And you can see, maybe I didn't know where I needed to be, but I can start coming through here and really starting embellishing what's going to go on with this stuff. I really don't know why I have 15-degree angles on those, but okay. Now, if you're doing a typical 2D detail, what's nice about this with the filled regions, you could do the same thing, but I can just go send this to the back. So now I don't have to worry about being on top of the model, not being on top of the model, etc. I can just start coming in here and really saying send to front, send to back, bring these things to where I want those to be and start getting this detail to be a little bit more graphic. So that send to front, send to back, we do have a lot of those different types of scenarios to be able to start coming through here and doing what we wanted it to do. Right? Oops, I wanted that slanted. We'll slant this, we'll bring it down, we'll send it back again, right? You'll also see in a lot of my families, I start building in a lot of things for, well, what if I did want the line on top of this? You are going to start to see properties in there. I talked a little bit about the start angle and the end angle, but I also might have properties in here of, gee, I want the face line on that. So now I can actually show in a given location like here, or maybe this one, you like that face line too. I can start toggling on and off that line. And I don't have to worry about everybody trying to remember different values for that line. It's always going to be the same consistent line, right? So we start going through and we get into this, and you can see I can go on. I can keep going in and placing a ton of stuff. Not going to kill the whole thing and you guys watching me build a detail here. So that's basically how this one was set up, right? We've got all these different families inside of here. We started to place things where we needed to get what we needed to do. But the thing that I really start liking about this is now when it comes time to notate, it looks like when I upgraded this to 21, I forgot to copy the right keynote file. But so when we start going through here and we annotate this stuff and we really start looking at this information, how often have you guys been in a thing and one person says on center, O period, C period, the next person just does OC, the next person spells it out on center, right? So we're getting into even inconsistency in the way we're naming things. So my preference is to tag things, right? So if I start coming in here and looking at information on this, and this view's pretty much been set up, but I can start choosing now to go through and tag things the way I want to tag. This particular view I have set up to be keynoted. So if I go to my annotate tab and I say, hey, I want to go do an element keynote, now I can grab this element, bring it across, and of course I didn't upgrade to 21, the right family, but I can start bringing this element across and getting these keynote values to fill out for me. And what's great about this is if you start changing it from one element to the next element, when you get into this, the keynote's going to update, but not only is that keynote going to update, and we'll have to grab something else here in a second, it's all going to be consistent, right? It's all going to say adjustable masonry anchoring veneer. One person's not going to spell out adjustable. One person's not going to put ADJ period. It's all going to be consistent. And what I love about that is you change it from one type of anchor to another type of anchor, that keynote is going to update as well, right? So we can start going through and setting this stuff up, and I'll show this a little bit more in the tagging version as well. So I think this is awesome. I love the way this stuff is set up. I'm not as big of a fan of keynoting as I am doing tags. And the reason for that is if I wanted to come through here and just put like, oh, gee, I have this sill plate here and I wanted to add, some sort of extra information of this needs to be pressure treated or this needs to be something else. With keynoting, I would have to have a completely different element. I'd have to have a 2x6 pressure treated or 2x6 with anchor bolts at 16 inches on center or whatever that additional note wants to be. I literally have to have an additional keynote value in there. So I'm gonna have like 4200 AA, AB, AC, and I'm gonna really start running out of characters quickly. For me, my personal preference is to actually tag everything. Nothing wrong with keynoting. Keynoting works. I personally think Autodesk needs to adjust that. But for me, what I like about this is I'm more into doing tagging. And what I mean by doing tagging, what's great about this is, like I just said, if I wanted to come in here and add additional piece of information, this adjustable masonry anchor, maybe I wanted to add a piece of text to this. If it was a keynote, like I said, it had to be a whole new keynote value in the TXT file that you're using for keynoting. But inside of here, my tags do a couple things. One of the things that I start looking at when I do my tags is my tags are start by default, grab the type comments. So this type comment, if I edit this family, you're going to see it does have a value for keynoting, right? That's what the other view is using. But this one gets in here and starts using type comments. So this is where it says adjustable masonry veneer anchor. Great. If I wanted every single adjustable masonry veneer anchor, I could be add text, right? So if I come in here and say I want to do that, now every single one of these I tag, if I go place another one of these components, that component is also going to have that same value if I tag it, right? So maybe you have 2 or 3, or you've got 500 different views using this object. It's now going to have that exact same scenario of adjustable masonry veneer anchor, add text, right? So when I see that and I start getting into it, that's great. But what if I needed just on this one location, I needed to say something additional to it? Well, I have my tags also pull out the comments. So I come in and say, like, I wanted additional, I'm not going to worry too much about spelling, additional comments, right? Now, this one value is seeing additional comments, the other one is not. So this becomes really, really great because right now I might want to tag this as, whatever this is, my anchor bolt. I don't know what it actually says, my 1/2 inch anchor rod. Forgot to switch that out. So I've got this 1/2 inch anchor rod, but in this case, these want to be at 10 inches on center or 16 inches on center. So I can come in here and say at 16 inches on center, right? So I can come in here and add additional information. Sure, it's still a 1/2 inch anchor rod, but in this particular location, I want that to be at 16 inches on center. All right, so starting to get set up and things like that. Now, what's great also about this is if I change this from a 1/2 inch anchor rod, or if I change it from a 2x6 to a 2x4 or whatever, as I change this value here, those type comments, or if you're doing keynoting, they're all going to start to update, right? So when we start really looking at this, this is where I think the advantage comes. I remember when I was back in the old AutoCAD days, yeah, we spelled on center 15 different ways. We spelled gypsum board 19 different ways. And this starts to build in a little bit more of that consistency. Now, I am introducing inconsistencies in the fact that I've allowed people to come in here and do the comments. I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit too. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in that we'll talk about. And somebody said, one of the questions came up from Caitlin is, don't know if you said it or not, do you nest a detail item into your 3D context or just use symbolic lines? So she was talking about, I'm sorry I missed that one, I didn't see it pop up. When I was into my real world one where I said these have X's, I'm not a big fan of nesting detail components into modeled objects. You can do that, but if you start thinking about, like I know out of the box Autodesk nests in a detail component to the curtain wall mullion. Well, curtain wall mullions get broken at every single curtain grid. So that detail component gets placed in every single one. So I might have 6,000 mullions in there. Therefore, that detail component is also getting placed 6,000 times. My personal opinion is do a generic or a symbolic line in this case, and then we'll come back and nest in detail component or just model detail components in where we need to put those detail components. So for something like this, I'm just going in and drawing symbolic lines. Curtain wall mullions, I do not believe things that are going to be a little more complicated, especially things I'm going to be using a crap ton of. I don't believe in nesting in detail components on that. So the other person talked about, there's another question came up asking about the detail guide. I'm going to talk about that here shortly because we're halfway into this. So we'll get that. And somebody else said, what is the advantage of using detail components versus a filled region? Right, so that's the whole thing that comes down to with this filled region, I can start to come in and set up tags the same way. So right, with this filled region, I can actually tag this. So if I'm going to come into this filled region, I can come in and say, hey, I wanted to tag that. And this filled region is going to be working the same way. So you can come down and do type comments inside of here. So if I came and said, these are my type comments, right? I can use type comments on this, still get the tag to see it. I can still use additional comments on here to see that. So you can do filled regions in the same way you can. The advantage where I think it is again, if somebody wanted a line at the top of this, sure, I can edit the boundary and now choose the right line. Which is the right line? What line am I using? What am I going through? What number are you going to be doing? One person's going to use a 15, the next person's going to use a 12. So for me, doing the filled regions is, again, you're now at the mercy of who's using the right line weight, or are they using the right line weights for what you're getting into? So that's kind of, to me, is why I use detail components more than filled regions. I'm not saying I don't use filled regions at all, but for me, it's really getting into what I think the consistency is there. So a couple things on that. So another one is, do you have guidelines when it's best to create a new type versus typing in the ad text? So somebody's comment on here on the comments is it better to have a 1/2 inch anchor rod that has the value of 16 inches on center and one that has a 24 inches on center? You know, every one of my firms does that slightly different. So when you're starting to look at, hey, what's going on in there, when to use comments versus just all type comments, depends on what you guys are looking at setting up. Personally, for me, I think what the element is the type comments, additional information like at 16 inches in center, and I'll show you some other ways around this as well. Can possibly some different scenarios, right? So, which led me into this. So when you start looking at like this rebar component here, right? I've got this rebar component here. This is a little bit different, and I probably should go back and add some of the information I have here to like my anchor rod families. Didn't think about it till just now. What you can actually see on here is this rebar component here, right? It's telling me there's 3 number 5s. Right? I can come up here and be like, no, in the tag, I didn't want 3 of those. Oh, wait, I can't change here. What's great about this is there is a formulas over here. So instead of the count, I can say, no, I wanted 5 of those. And if I update the 5 here, not only is that graphically changing the value here, that is pulling out and updating the information here. So I do have different types of detail component tags. If I grab this detail component tag, you can see it's saying rebar size and quantity. So what value this tag is looking for is it's actually looking for the size shared or custom parameter built into that family, as well as the quantity. It is not using the type comments like the other one was. It's truly using different parameters. So for me, I've got this set up, but I very well easily could, for like this component in that properties, add the quantity value, so then I could be tagging quantity as well. So just depends on what level you guys want to take it to. This rebar component here, you can see that the alternating rebar is all something here that's all one and the same. What's great about this is I've got that alternating bar just to be a checkbox, right? So I've got this thing as, hey, I want to have my alternating bars at the side. But watch what's going to happen when I uncheck that. The bar here is going to disappear, but also then my tag over here disappears. So built into these elements, I've got also additional values where I have custom properties for suffix and or prefix sometimes that are not something people fill out. They can, but they're not usually something one of my users fill out. Those are values that I predetermine to add text automatically, right? So as I start coming through here and toggling certain things, I can get these tags to start coming up and responding to that as well. The other thing that you'll start to see is, let me just come in here and grab like this, this piece of masonry, right? So inside of here, when I look at this piece of masonry, I might want to come in and say in a given location, oh, in the comments, I want this to say beyond, right? I've already typed in beyond once, so Revit will let me choose the way I've already typed it. What's really great about this is I put the word beyond in my comments, and then notice what happens. I've also now have filters built in based off of the comments to do certain things to those, right? So if I come up here and look at my, is it this one? Nope. Yeah, this one. You can start to see that I've got all of these little components here that I typed in the word beyond. It picks up that type of object, but then it's going to go in and have some filters built in to change the graphic looks of things. So therefore, granted, if somebody does this wrong and they spell it with all uppercase beyond, if that's your standard, which probably is, wrong one, it might not build in that filter because I spelt it incorrectly. Or if I put the word beyond, or I spelt beyond wrong, right? That one element is not going to be filtered. Oh, it is. Why is that still working? That should not be working. Beyond, right? So there's some pre-built filters I have set up to start doing things like that. Or if I change that from beyond to existing, then there's a different filter that halftones it but keeps the hatch patterns. So different ways to start coming through and setting some of this stuff up using Revit filters as well. Okay, so we're gonna jump into filters real quick. View filters. So you will see I've got some things in here, and these are very simple filters. They're just saying, hey, I'm looking at detail items, and if the comment contains beyond, that's the filter. I've got one for existing, which just says if comment contains EXIS, and I've got one for scheduled, so somebody puts the word scheduled in there, right? So all these different things where the comments or type comments can say something, and then in the properties of the view or in the properties of the view template, in the filters tab, I basically am just saying, hey, if you see detail items beyond, halftone it. And turn off the hatch patterns. If you say detail items existing, halftone it, but leave the hatch pattern alone. So different ways for me to start coming through here and building in filters that also work in conjunction with using those comments, okay? So starting to go through and just building that information in. And I even use detail components for things that look like a line. So this just looks like somebody drew a detail line to get this. But for me, I have Revit families that are also just basically line-based components like you saw with my earth, but all that's on there is a single line. So again, I can come in here and be like, ooh, you know, I wanted to grab all these detail components. And I don't want that to be building wrap. I wanted that to be something else like, you know, fluid applied membrane. And once I do that, my text is going to update with that. So as I start changing the lines, even though there's still detail components out to be something else, all of my information is updating as well, right? So in the Revit world, one of the other things that I get into as well is I get into detail items, right? So we've been doing all these detail items, but we can schedule this. I think it was Revit 16, 15. They gave us the capability to come in here and start actually scheduling these components. So I have a schedule that shows me all of the different components, what the type comments are, as well as what comments did I have. So I can start using this to see, oh, gee, I have one that's uppercase and one that's lowercase. Oops, that's wrong. This one I should come in here and just say it was beyond, and now I can make sure my spelling is the same. Wow, I happen to have one that says O period, C period, and the other one says OC. So I can start using this schedule where I'm allowing people to put in comments to go through here and make sure we're spelling correctly, we're going through and doing those things. So for me, I export this out to an Excel spreadsheet, use spell check, see if there's any spelling errors, fix the spelling errors and re-import it back in via one of the external tools you can use that for. Or at the very least, export it out via Revit, see where the spelling errors are, bring it in, just manually in Revit, go fix those spelling errors, right? So you can use this schedule to start seeing what's going on. You can also start seeing what's going on with this stuff and the fact of how many times did I use this object? Gee, I've got unit masonry 8 times with no comments, 1 time where it says existing. So you can really start to see how many times have you used this detail component, right? My adjustable shelf hole family, I've used 82 times. So we really start coming through here and seeing what's going on, what information do we need to be setting up in that, how can we start going through and doing that. Okay, so we'll jump into that. So that's kind of how the detailing works. Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. But now, how do we place this stuff onto a sheet? So if I go down to sheets and I start expanding this sheet here, start coming in and using this, and now I've got these views set up, right? So personally for me, I showed you I had those little detail guides. I draw those reference planes in underneath that detail guide. But now for me in this sheet, I happen to have title blocks matching the same type of scenario. So I have a title block that's got the same 4 columns and 3 rows. And now when you see I drop that in, it's kind of giving me the same scenario of, look, here's where those orange boxes should align. I should be able to see what's going on. So if I wanted to drag in one of those details that I just started with, right, I can bring that detail in. And now when I bring that detail in, I can grab it, use the move command. If there's reference planes drawn in that view, I can snap that reference plane to this guide. Come on, find the endpoint. Hate it when Revit's doing that for me. Find the intersection of the guide here, come down here and place it. And now I've got that detail in there. My title block also then starts to show me this is where roughly that view's title should be. So I can line it up here, hover over and say, oh, gee, look at that, pretty much where I wanted that to be. So I kind of use some of these things to try to get me to line it up. And you'll also see inside of there, I have like all these little orange lines. Those are just to help me like say, note that view needs to fit in here. Dimensions go outside of it or below it, right? If there was a grid head, it'd go up here. And then this is where my text, I can't snap to those, unfortunately, but it just does kind of give me some areas to give me rough ideas of where this stuff's gonna be. So as I start going through and completing this and setting it up, it's looking a little bit cleaner when I place it on a sheet. Now, the last thing I have when talking about this is all of the families like the title block, etc. These orange lines are going to print. And I know I'm never going to remember to go back and grab this title block and switch it back to the no guide. Somebody's going to go print. You're going to have all this orange stuff all over the place. I did choose orange. It prints a pretty light gray. But what happens in here is I do have toggles to turn this stuff on and off, right? You're going to notice my toggle to turn this off is grayed out. The reason this toggle is grayed out is I've associated this to a global parameter. So I've got a global parameter set up in my project called turn off for plot, that if I untick this and hit OK, it's going to go to any family that was associated to that, turn off all of those orange lines, right? They're even turned off now in this detail guide family. Oops, I thought I had the detail guide family. It's turned off in the detail guide family, right? They're gone. I hit print. I go back to my global parameter, I turn it back on, everybody can go about their day. So I've even associated global parameters to a lot of things inside the families that will allow me to toggle those on and off when we start doing that as well. Okay, so we're getting to some more of the questions. I already answered this one. So a couple other questions in here. What customizations need transfer easily to new Revit versions? If they don't, how can we make sure it can update it? Our office is new to BIM and still developing standards. As long as you have the stuff built into your components and you've got a template, every year you upgrade, that stuff should happen. I've changed my standards 5 or 6 times in the years I've been doing it. So I go through and push those standards through. So yeah, as long as you're upgrading it, everything should start going through really well and upgrade just fine as long as you're creating families in a very stable type of scenario. Another question on keynoting. Are you placing, when you place keynotes over an image, like demolition photos or something like that, how do you get them to place over the image? Terry, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I don't do keynoting over images that often. It's something I will have to look into. I'm gonna look into that, see if I come up with a solution and maybe put it on my blog. Next question was, do you save all the detail components in your main Revit project, or do you keep them in a separate project and only load them in your project for the details when it's important? This is always a good big question that comes up with people is, do you put all your standard details and detail components in your template, or do you have a separate file for that? My personal opinion is, if I'm an architect, every single project's gonna have an interior door detail, right? Head, jamb, sill, whatever it's gonna be. Those are in my project. If I'm a structural engineer, every project's gonna have a footing and foundation detail, right? Those are in the project. Now, I might not have door details in the project that are CMU and stucco and metal panel, because those are all gonna be different based on the type of system. So my personal opinion is I literally keep, there's actually two ways. I have another way to nest or link details themselves into projects. I either keep all of my details in a separate file like that I can link in, or I go through and I have details just in a separate file that I copy and paste those details across. You are going to run into the problem in Revit that when you copy and paste, you're going to start getting detail component 2, gypsum wall, board, bound, footing, whatever. You're going to get all of those components repeated. And the reason for that is Revit does not see the information. If Revit sees the families as a different save, so on the project, if it has a different save date than the one on your server or the one you're copying it from, Revit will create duplicates. One of the ways around that is to load all of the detail components from your server into your file you're copying it from and into your current project. And then it'll see they have the same save date and it won't go through and duplicate those. But that is an issue in Revit. It's just a Revit issue. So if you are copying and pasting multiple times, you're more than likely going to get multiple different detail components. So to me, it just depends. I have some clients who keep 0 detail items in their template, and they nest or link everything in through a linking process that I've come up with. I have other clients who like, no, we load them all into the project and then we delete what we don't need. So there's not a real great way for that. I think it's just going to kind of be one of those things once you start getting inside of there. Oops. So the other thing is, another question came up. Have I ever used color to identify different membranes and detail components, etc.? You absolutely could do that, and you can do it one of two ways. So one structural engineering firm I work with, all of their rebar, the different size, a different color than a 10M. Yes, it's a metric client. So they color code those. That is built into the family. So the rebars themselves have different filled regions for the different size of the family. So if it's a number 5, it's blue. If it's a number 6, it's green, whatever. You could also do that exact same thing with filters. So somebody was saying like maybe for the membranes, the type of membranes use colors, I could use the same line weight and I could pre-build in filters like you saw me do with existing, et cetera, that basically said, hey, if the type comment contains, air barrier, then let's color code it this way. So that way, technically, if I went and grabbed a brick and I put air barrier in the brick type comments, it would color code it as well. I am absolutely a person who thinks things in Revit should be more color coded based off of data. My code plans are all color coded. I do wall heights that are all color coded. I do a lot of color coding with clients. I believe color should be there based off of data, not just be there because you want it to look like AutoCAD. So yes, I absolutely go through and set that up and use colors for things. That's just going to be all depending on what you're looking at with the type of people you have. So another person came up and Beth asked, what's the reason to use type comments instead of description? You can use type comments or you can use description. The only reason I chose type comments is there's also the instance-based comments. So it's like, hey, if you're pulling out the tagging information for this, you're using type comments and comments. It made sense to me. I think when I first started presenting this back in 2010, I used description. There is no rhyme or reason, just other than that was my reasoning, but it's all the same way you're creating a parameter. The one thing I will say is, as I did say, I do have custom parameters for like prefix and suffix. Any custom shared parameter you create in that element, if that element is nested, so in this case, I can actually nest, I've got nested in for the weep head. If I nest that in and I then were to go tag that weep head, I cannot in that weep vent area tab into that and get instance-based shared parameters. So you'll see suffix and prefix are there. That is a custom nested into the brick family. I cannot change those. So any custom shared parameter I use, I don't use those for everyday tagging because if they're nested into something else, I can't tab select it to get it. So I do use type comments. That'd be the only I'd say there really is no difference between type comments or description. Somebody asked, what is the best way to import 2D details from AutoCAD? My opinion on that is never imports. The only way I ever bring any sort of CAD element is I will link that CAD detail in. So if I've got a CAD detail, I break them out on an individual DWG basis. So if I've got like one sheet that's got 500 CAD details, I break each one of those CAD details out, I link it in. Honest truth, if I've linked that detail in more than once, if I do it twice or 3 different projects, in my mind, that means you need to start converting that to a native Revit component. And I get people asking me the question all the time, I spent thousands of hours creating my CAD details, what am I doing in Revit? And I look at those same people and say, well, you spent thousands of hours creating sticky back details. I didn't see anybody using sticky back details from the pencil drafting days in their CAD drawings, right? You might have for the first year or two, they're not still doing it. So my thing is, sure, if it's a one-off detail, you might use it one time, you've downloaded it from a manufacturer, but then also just accept the fact it's not going to match your graphic standards. It is going to look different, it is going to be different, the hatch patterns are going to display, the text might freak out. It is not going to match your Revit standards. It is what it is. I did ask the question, the thing earlier, does anybody go in and explode the CAD files? That is something that in my mind, if you do that, you get fired. That is not something I do. Exploded CAD information is a terrible thing because that more than likely will start to corrupt your project. I see people also go grab like an AutoCAD block, bring it into Revit, explode it, and try converting that in Revit family. Again, not something I ever do. I've seen too many clients have too many projects. We find that, oh, this family is causing the corruption. Oh, that family, somebody exploded a DWG inside of it. It's not something that I ever do. So for me, if I'm going to be doing anything with DWGs, I link it in, put it in the view I need it to be in, and I don't explode. I don't try to do anything. It is what it is. And if I bring that detail in more than once, it needs to be converted. Another question is, do you have a special way to link the standard details prepared in a separate model? Yes, there is something on that. If you guys go to Autodesk University, I think I've done that session twice at Autodesk University. It's called like nested details, or just search for Brian Mackey and you'll see some of my sessions in there. But I do have a way to actually link details into a project, update that information that has only the linked details in it, and it can update your project. It works really well for, originally came up with this back in 2005 with a client who did strip malls. They do 20 different packages on the 20 different buildings, but all the details were the same. So we created a detail file, linked that into the 20 different buildings, and if they updated the detail once, it would automatically be updated in all the details. So yes, there is a way to do that. That's a whole nother 2-hour session in and of itself. What are some of the good arguments to convince staunch AutoCAD fans to do detailing in Revit? The people who think they're fast in AutoCAD detailing are the people who've spent 20 years setting up their AutoCAD details. I will guarantee you, if I have my Revit component like this and all my Revit components, my detail items are pre-set up, I can out detail your best Revit, your best AutoCAD person. Because AutoCAD might give them all the blocks, but unless they're using dynamic blocks in AutoCAD, they're probably not parametric. So if they need to go in and change this block to be a 6-inch brick or whatever, they're going to be going through and getting into a considerable amount of editing for that element. If I need a new one, I change it, I go through, I duplicate it, I change the parameters I have set up, it's done. So the thing is, to me, is everybody thinks they're faster in AutoCAD because they've been spending 20 years developing those AutoCAD standards. They're trying to use Revit out of the box and say, well, look, AutoCAD's faster. Okay, throw away everything you have in AutoCAD, now use AutoCAD out of the box and you tell me what's faster. There's no way. I was an AutoCAD guru. I did Lisp routines. I used AutoCAD back in the DOS-based days. When we start getting into that information, I was an AutoCAD guru. I found this in Revit. I'm like, yeah, there's that. And I even got into AutoCAD dynamic blocks when they started coming out back in 2004, and still not as good as what I can do in Revit. So for me, that's the only thing I have, is literally spend some time, get some things developed, and show somebody how quick it is. And then in AutoCAD, again, unless they're using, there's no way to tag those dynamic blocks with data. They're still putting they might be putting in an attributed block, but then come in and say, oh, well, what if you want that to be a 2x6 pressure treated, or we wanted to change all the X's in this, every single detail you have to be an uppercase X. How do you do that? Make one change in Revit where you go through and say, oh, okay, let's change this to be an uppercase X. And I've just updated that detail component in 500 details. I'm done. Go back to AutoCAD and do that, right? So it's kind of one of those things for me. Let me get into the detail guide. Actually, it's actually on my blog to post as well. And somebody came in and said, Evan came in and said, you know, all of these optimizations are good and well, but how have you begun the process of implementing these kinds of drafting methods into firms. You know, the big thing on this is this is a time investment, right? There are a whole bunch of out-of-the-box components, but the out-of-the-box components aren't going to maybe necessarily meet your graphic standards. They might not be as parametric as you want. This is a time investment. Don't get me wrong. You are going to spend time. I have one client. They now have, I think, over 1,000 detail items. They have over 600, you know, standard typical details in a file. They probably had a person spend a year to get all of that stuff up and set the way they needed to, right? I mean, in overall scheme of things, it probably took them a year to do that. A lot of it was my help at the beginning, and then you got people to do it. So it is an investment in doing this. But just as it is in anything else, if you start sitting there thinking about it, how many times are people drawing filled regions, right? The amount of time it takes somebody to draw a filled region, go through, set this up, draw the line. Now that if somebody's redlining, it doesn't look correct. The amount of time you put into that stuff usually starts to become part of it. And I'm getting close to running out of time, but yeah, so that's just kind of one of the things you're in there. There is a lot of investment into this, but the payoff on that investment, it's huge. And depending on how you start getting into things of, you know, how you start setting these families up, a lot of it's not as big of a time suck as you think. And I'm going to use that as my lead into the next session. So the next thing I really wanted to get into and start talking about is creating these components, right? So if I were to come in here and start looking, I'm just going to grab the gypsum wall board, right? I'm going to edit this family. So when I start coming in here and looking at this family, this is a detail component family. I do turn all my reference planes and stuff off. What you can start to see is this is a line-based detail component family, right? So I started with the out-of-the-box line-based detail component. I do add some things inside of here. So for me, there are a lot of things that are shared parameters. So I've got my start line, my end line, my face line, right? Thickness is a shared parameter in case I wanted to schedule that. And I've got these end angles. These are also shared parameters. But so for me, I started with the out-of-the-box family, and then I started coming in here and just, you know, starting to embellish some things, right? And go add a 5-degree angle. So I came into this gypsum component family, I added a reference line, added a parameter for the start angle and end angle, right? Then on top of that, literally all it is drawing a filled region. So just like you would have done in a project, I drew a filled region in here, right? No different, go to create, go to filled region, choose the filled region type, just like you would have done in a project, right? Then I came through here and drew my lines. And the only difference between this and in a project environment is when I started drawing these lines, I started aligning and locking them to the reference planes inside of here, right? So I could have been like, oh, there's my line. Now I need to align and lock it to this reference plane. Once I went through and did that on all the lines, I finished this family out, and now I happen to come in here and have all of this information set up, right? So for me, I realized after I did the first one of this going, oh crap, I'm gonna use a crap ton of these where I'm gonna have the start angle, the end angle. So for me, I went through and created a template. So I have all of my own templates in Revit, right? So I've got my own detail item line-based family. If you start with the out of the box, you get one line. It just gives you a length value. That's all that's there. So for me, I created my own line-based template for this. So when I come in here and start looking at this, I've got my line-based template where I've got the reference planes already built in. I've got the parameters of thickness and start in, all those parameters pre-built in. So now anytime I go create a new line-based detail component, I can start with this template, right? Even if I go in and create a blank standard detail component, I have just a detail item template as well. There's not as much going on with this detail item template, right? It's just got 2 reference planes, but it might have some of my shared parameters in there, like suffix and prefix and things pre-built into this as well. So when I start going in and working on this, I've got a lot of this stuff set up, pre-baked into my templates. Now, one other thing that's really nice is, great, let's say I've done the gypsum wall board, and yeah, I have the gypsum wall board one here created. Now you need one for concrete. What's really great about Revit, and what didn't take me so much time to do a lot of this, is once you get one set up and tested, you made sure you've put it in a project, you've played with the start angle, the end angle, you've added comments, type comments, etc. Once you've got that stuff all set up and done, what's great about it is it's simply then a save as, right? I go in, I go file, I do a save as on this, and then all I have to do once I've done that save as is grab the masking region and change it to be a different one. Oh, gee, I wanted this to be just solid fill black, or I wanted this to be my concrete detail component. Then I go in and change some of the types out, right? Delete all the types, create a 6-inch wall, an 8-inch wall, and start really doing that. So if you go back into the project and we start really looking at what's going on in my project here, I started with my gypsum wall board detail component, and then that got saved as to be my concrete. That got saved as to be my my sheathing. That got saved as to be my earth. And then I realized, oh, I want a little squiggly on the earth, so I redid the squiggly. But really quickly, I came through and came in, set this up, went through and grabbed that information. I just kept doing save as, save as, save as. So that one gypsum board detail component became my steel on the sides, my stud on the sides. I mean, I literally, if I go into my detail items and start looking at those, you know, I started, like I said, with gypsum wallboard, and then it's kind of came in, anything that was line based, it was a save as. So that got saved into not some of these, like my gypsum acoustical underlayment. If I go back to concrete, that got saved into my concrete component. So literally that got saved as, and a little bit of tweaking here and there got saved into my metals. So it even looks like, you know, my sheet metal section. It's just changing the filled regions out, whatever it needs to be. So it's kind of one of those things that it looks like a big time suck, but really starting to get into this, you can start doing it. Now, yes, there are other detail component families that I have. Where'd it go? I want my, it's coming up in the background. There are some other detail component families that if you start looking at and getting into, yeah, this family is insane. This was not one of those families that I created in a few minutes. This family's got hundreds of parameters. It's got formulas. This is me taking Revit to the extreme, getting into some of this stuff, right? So you can take these families to the extreme and really start doing some crazy things in there. A lot of these families also get into code information, right? So this is where somebody starts saying, what about AutoCAD versus the Revit stuff as well? I don't allow this to break code. If you try to make, and what I mean by that is if you try to come into this, that's not what I wanted. If you try to come into this element here and you try to make this shorter than code, oh, I want to stretch this to here. Nothing happens because code allows it and tells me the minimum code value is here, right? If I change this from a number 5 to a number 8, same thing is going to start happening inside of here is my code is going to say, oh, that bend needs to be bigger and that length needs to be bigger. Right, so we can start building code into a lot of the information when we're doing this as well, which you're not going to be able to do in AutoCAD. So a lot of things can start to happen. Same thing would be true of this. If I said, go give me, 55 of these, Revit's going to come in and give me this big red filled region saying, hey, that doesn't meet code. So really when you start getting into this and start getting into a lot of the stuff, it gets, what are you trying to accomplish in Revit besides just the simplistic out of the box, here's a piece of brick. Here's a piece of that. What really are we trying to accomplish to speed up all of the tasks? And then last but not least, a question did come up is, how did you create this detail guide family? This detail guide family really isn't anything that special. I do believe it's on my website, probably back from like 2012 blog post I did on this, but this is my detail guide family, right? It's got reference planes, it's parametric, it's got a width value, it's got a height value. These values are all just padlocks where I needed them to be. But basically in this family, it just then gives me a sheet width, a sheet height, the border of that sheet. So that's going to be different for each client. And there's a formula saying, hey, take all of those and divide it by this. And that gives me the actual width and height of each family. So you start getting into this, it's looking a bit overwhelming. I've shown some of this stuff. I'm running out of time here, so I'm trying to get all this. But as you start looking at this, it's just tweak this and get it to be what you want. If you guys are watching this webcast and you think you want anything, feel free to email me. I am a person that has the attitude of, if I present, I have a feeling that it's something I give to people, right? So if it's anything you want to have come in and you saw me present it, you're like, hey, I need that detail guide family, great, email me and I will send it out to you. So here's all of my stuff. And then there was one other question. It looks like a couple other questions I did not get to in this that pertain to me. One person asks is, can you wrap the text of a long tag description when you start looking at it? So text tagging in Revit, you cannot wrap. Go back to Revit real quick. So we go back into any of these views in here. If this text starts to get too wide, there's no way to say make this wrap. So the reason I have this detail guide is I know from here to here as a given value, my tag matches that given value, right? So if I were to select that host object and add even more words, right? Then I've got this tag set up to fit in this box. So if it gets too long, it's automatically going to word wrap and not just continue. It's literally going to start coming in and saying, oh, I've built my tag to match my detail box, right? Again, following all of those standards. If somebody wants to go off of the rails and do whatever they wanted to do, yeah, you're gonna have to create tags that have different widths values in here and go through and set that up. So there's kind of a downside in Revit when you get into there. Uh, oh, somebody actually gave me a tip. See, so I love it when people give me tips. When loading a family in, it pops up in the background, hit F10 and it comes forward. So I did not know that F10 was a shortcut for brings the family forward. Thank you for that, Dustin. So I know I kind of rushed you guys through this. It was an hour-long presentation. I have went 5 minutes over. The other thing I do want to give myself a shameless plug on here, go back into here, and I don't think I have it on here, is I have, and you can actually go to my website, the bdmackeyconsulting.com. There is a page on there. It says Revit Radio. I do a live question and answer where there is no topic. You guys ask questions and I answer them live. So I do a live Revit Radio talk where it's just you ask a question, I answer it live. If nobody asks questions, then you get to hear me and the other Brian just talk for an hour. I know there's a few people on here that I see that come to Revit Radio quite often. So that is one of the things that I do. I really love doing Revit Radio, and it gives everybody those questions. And if there's something you needed to follow up on here, I've also, if you go to YouTube, I used to work for an Autodesk reseller called CAD1, and I did detailing in Revit on their website for them. I've taught this session often. The one I did for CAD1 was 3 one-hour sessions, so it might get a little bit more in depth into it as well. Or I'm sure if we wanted to go a little bit more, I could probably team up with ATG and do a little bit more in depth on maybe just creating some of this content as well. So hopefully that gives everybody an answer to what they're doing. And somebody's even asking, do you present for local user groups? Sure, if you're a local user group and you want me to do a presentation, I'm all about sharing the knowledge. The more knowledge we share, it makes us better as an industry. So if anybody wants to come in and say, hey, will you present for a local user group? I know I've presented for a couple user groups through ATG. I've actually even presented to user groups in Europe. So it doesn't matter to me as long as I'm not up at midnight for anybody. I'm all about sharing the knowledge and finding the best tool for people to do. So hopefully that answers everyone's question. Like I said, if you need to get in contact with me or you have any questions, feel free to do this, and also look at Revit Radio. Otherwise, I really appreciate all of you guys, coming in here and spending an hour of your billable time. I know that's pretty precious stuff to deal with, and hopefully you guys learned something and you'll be going, man, I might not put all this together, but that was a great tip, and I'll go through and start doing that way. So thanks everybody. Look forward to seeing you guys in the future. Thanks.